Again for joining us in this unique event. So we've got a hybrid experience coming live from Learning Technologies. For those that have dialed in remotely, sorry you couldn't be here in person, but hopefully we'll be able to share at least some of the excitement and opportunity and interesting discussion that's coming. For those that are with us today, thanks for taking half an hour out of your day to talk with myself. I'm Ollie Browning, the VP of Sales for Go1. We are an online aggregation platform and content provider. And I'm joined by the incredible David Perrin. David, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
I always enjoy our conversations. David is the Director of Research for Fosway Group, who I'm sure you all know, but if not, David, you are here exhibiting today and no doubt doing various other discussions with your repertoire, so please take the time to go and see with Fosway. And today what we want to talk about, we've been doing some exciting research with Fosway all around the world of content. So as you can see around, if you haven't been here for long, there are lots of providers, all with lots of content, lots of different platforms. It's really important for us to just try and get a little bit underneath that and try and understand some of the insights that come from the market about why are people using content, what are they using for, what makes good content, and ultimately, how do we develop a world-class strategy? So I'm really going to ask David to share some of the interim results that we've had so far. The opportunity is still there to participate in that research, and we'll share the details at the end of this discussion, and I'm sure speak to some of the team on the stand and they'll be able to direct you in the way of accessing that. And then later in the summer we will be sharing all of the results from that in due course. And if you happen to be here tomorrow or dialing in tomorrow, I'll be having a panel discussion with a number of industry practitioners where we'll be hearing a little bit more of how they've applied some of the insights and strategy and really bring some of the research to life. So that's probably enough for me. David, if I hand over to you and maybe set some of the scene of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, definitely, very much so. So thank you very much for commissioning the research. I think with Go1 we've been almost sort of trying to understand what makes digital learning effective and what is the right combinations, not just around off-the-shelf content, but also the user-generated content and bespoke content that people get developed themselves. So we've been looking at that area, and we've asked a range of questions of the... There we go, people are different.
Teething problems on day one.
Yeah, there we go. So what we've been looking at is really asked a number of people. It's a very small sample at the moment, about 140 that we've engaged with. They're mainly from Europe, so 71%. There's smaller scattering from places like Australasia and North America and Africa. They're typically from smaller organizations, the people who've responded so far. So organizations that are less than 2,000 employees make up about 73% of the respondents. But it's almost representative of the sorts of general global mix of organizations you find out there in the industry anyway, right? There's a very smaller percentage of organizations that have over 10,000 employees. But overall, you've got about a third who are sort of maybe what you call medium to large enterprise organizations. And some of the things that have already come out is just the sense of actually the voice of this customer that we're hearing through the research is very much from people who work in smaller teams. Now, I don't know what size team you're in. Are you in a team of 1, 2, 5, 10, 15, 20? Most people are working in small teams, and I think that makes sense because we're looking at smaller organizations, but it helps you appreciate that actually within those small teams, there's a lot of stress around the amount of delivery that they have to do, really relative to the scale of the organizations they're working in. So these resources are inherently stretched, and actually that does put pressure on people's ability to innovate and scale and deliver. So we understand that actually it's hard, and the only way to work effectively probably as an internal team is to partner with others. And I'm sure you do that very routinely in terms of the people that you work with to help you scale and reach a broader audience. Those most work, a smaller number about 22% work as part of a centralized team, and only half work around sort of an operational team. So there is this sort of strong sense of being integrated into the business from our audience. Now, I don't want to talk about the audience, but hopefully it just gives you a sense of the people who've responded, so it gives you a lens onto the answers that they've given us. So what I want to go through is really just to explore why do organizations say that they use digital learning content. And this is just a series of information. Now, what we're going to do is start effectively with a poll of why you use digital learning content in your organization. So you should have a poll available to you, and we're going to share that online. And you've got some choices here. Is it primarily your top reason about developing a learning culture? Is that important to you? Is it about reaching a hybrid workforce, one that's now been dispersed as a result of new flexible working patterns? Is it about scaling L&D delivery so that actually you can be more than a team of 5 but feel like a team of 200 when you're having to roll out programs and learning? You also have an element of maybe reducing costs. Is that important to you? It's been a strong feature of digital learning in the past. Enabling blended learning or enhancing learning quality. It's interesting just maybe to reflect on what your priorities would be. Yeah. So if you've got a chance to vote, please vote. I think the votes should be coming in. I don't know what you can see on screen, Ollie, for you, just to get a sense of
the results from online.
Okay. Do we get to see that on the both screens?
I will be able to tell you those results as they come through.
Sure.
I think people here can vote if they've logged into the app, but I think there's some interesting statements there, and interested to see what people...
I think it's always interesting, and maybe the people who are here, is that sense of what are you about as a learning team? And is a learning culture really top of your priorities, or is it about flexing what you do? And I think it's always an interesting part of the conversation. Increasingly, I think people look to deliver business value, and that's what their usual number one driver is, but that doesn't say why you're adopting digital learning. But hopefully this will just give us a sense of some of that, some nuance. So any answers through?
I'm just looking to my left for the team who will be publishing those, but not just yet. I think having known some of the results, I'm quite surprised. Some of the more obvious ones, perhaps not as prevalent
so it looks
as
like we
you
got
might
something
expect.
coming
So I can see here that unanimously, which is consistent with what we've seen, that developing a learning culture is number one, and the second one is all around reaching a hybrid workforce. So no real great surprises, I don't think, David, given what we've gone through in the last 2 years. But perhaps let's bring to life
have a look and
some
see
of the other areas.
Let's see what the 140 people said. So the number one thing that came out, the thing that people are using is develop learning culture. And I think what is interesting, does the technology deliver the culture, or is it the behaviors of the people within the organization that deliver the culture? And what role is the digital learning having or playing in developing learning in your organization? It's not always necessarily clear cut. Number two, reaching the first workforce. That was the number 2 reason why people said that they wanted to embrace digital work, learning. Obviously people are either in the field now, or they're in the office, or they're at home, and that drives a need to scale and distribute learning in a new way. And also number 3, this sense of actually just providing greater flexibility and speed. So actually being able to get learning to people faster, at scale, with greater agility. That was number 3 reason. So in some ways, maybe the only surprise was the fact that cost was the lowest reason. So maybe if you'd gone back 5-10 years ago, people would have said, do you know what, I'm putting in digital learning because I can't afford to do the amount of training that I needed to do, doing that face-to-face, and digital learning was the natural option. Cost is no longer the top option. That was the most frequently rated as number 8 out of 8 options. So cost isn't the driver as much as it used to be. The other thing that we asked was just the sense of, why are you adopting digital learning, and what are the significant drivers around adopting digital learning content? And again, the interesting thing is this sense of skills and upskilling being at the top of the list, sense of that enabling digital learning being that sort of number 2, but also number 3 being the regulatory compliance. Again, I think if you'd have gone back 5 or 10 years, it would have been very focused purely around, I need to deliver a shed load of compliance training, and that's it. The world seems to have moved on, and I think that has been prompted partly by the pandemic and the need to adopt new approaches. This sense of growth mindset, personal effectiveness, health and safety, those sort of, I suppose, regulatory compliance and health and safety are part of that sort of regulatory environment, so they're things that people have to do, and you find that people often use digital learning to scale that out. But the personal effectiveness, and I think that growth mindset, are maybe linked into that sense of trying to release that learning culture. So there is a join up between some of these responses already. The other thing is what we asked, why does you use off-the-shelf content specifically? And how people use it within organizations isn't about just using it as a standalone catalog. Again, I think back in the day when people would have bought into digital learning maybe in the noughties, maybe 15 years ago, they would have said, actually, I'm just buying a digital learning content and that just fills a gap and we're not doing much with it. Increasingly, what seems to be the process now is people are embedding it within their broader learning design. It forms part of the blend that they're delivering to enable them to scale their learning. And I think that comes out really strongly in the results. Like you've got 60% who said that that's their top reason for using off-the-shelf content, specifically as part of their digital learning portfolio. And interestingly, there's the next ones are about upskilling, and you can probably link that back to career development and performance management. So there is this sort of overlay of driving higher performance, and maybe that is blending it not only into a learning process, but a performance development process. So building in those hooks where when you have a performance development review, actually maybe the system or systems are also prompting content into the mix. So that actually it's not just about getting feedback when you're doing a performance review with a manager, actually it's about having recommendations for other learning that you can do, and creating elements of that.
Yeah, I think that those results particularly were interesting. You know, I always sort of talk with customers about how I don't believe online content will on its own solve many of your learning issues, which can be controversial as a aggregated content provider, but I think this just really validates some of those statements about where it can be used effectively. I think the sort of build it and they will come strategy of cost reduction, large libraries, lack of engagement really just proved this point. So It's about, have you got the right content for the right problem in the right solution that's going to help drive the better outcome?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it is that sort of mix almost into driving more developmental conversations and how it features there, which is really probably the takeaway. And I think if you're thinking about driving that learning culture, actually this was almost part of a recipe plan. It says if you mix it in with your upskilling, if you mix it in with your performance development, if you mix it in with career development, actually that does become something that is a way of creating more success.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other thing we asked was some questions around the sorts of audiences that digital learning supports. And again, really interesting that if you look at the red as being the high priority, the pink being medium priority, and that sort of almost the white zone being low priority, most of the audiences, whether they're operational, project change, customer facing, IT, or sales, they are all a priority in some form. But the highest priority is for the largest audiences, those operational teams that are focused really around delivering the organization's objectives ultimately. Yeah. So, and again, that's a really interesting takeaway, that it's the areas where it's less so some of the specialists around finance and maybe leadership. And I was surprised in a way that maybe leadership didn't feature more significantly.
Yeah, I think as we come on to in some of the other areas of research, we see where people traditionally use bespoke, tailored, or even in-house developed content. I think this does reflect that, and certainly with our customers, you know, whether we're talking to new prospects or our existing customers, this represents where they would use more, you know, generic off-the-shelf content rather than needing specialist topics for their organisation, particularly leadership and management. We're seeing a lot of people, you know, using some of the curated content to support their program, but also, given the scale challenge, recognising that it doesn't have to be unique to their organisation, and the sort of entry-level components of that content can be delivered in a standard way.
Exactly. So, what we also asked the audience was, how do L&D teams maximize the adoption of digital learning content? So, what techniques are they using to get people to use the content itself? And again, we got some polling questions to get people to have a look at. And this really represents maybe some of the common approaches that organizations use to advertise their learning. So things like company-wide marketing. So that could be like a direct mail out, it could be putting out posters, it could be sending out leaflets, all those sorts of things that enable you to reach a dispersed audience, and which is actually probably a bit more about email now than it used to be in the office. So there's that sort of broadcast approach. Then you've got that sense of actually we market or we drive adoption through blended learning. And then you've got this thing around actually we embed it in our career development and career planning, because that would drive adoption, because if people are using it to help them progress in their careers. But also the sense of peer recommendations being as an important layer, and also the targeted marketing campaigns. And the difference between maybe using company-wide marketing and that targeted marketing campaign is much more about how we use maybe personalized messaging around people's sense of audience or identity or whatever feedback or insight you have about them, to just send them things that are relevant to them. So this, again, we've got some feedback, and hopefully that's coming through
shortly
in the charts.
I think this is a fascinating topic. Where I'm sat now, I can probably see 3 different stands talking about curation. Engagement is the number 1 topic around content. So, the build it and they will come may or may not work, and hopefully my eyesight's slightly tricky, but the first one unanimously is about actually part of a blended program. So again, as a standalone solution, it may or may not drive adoption or specifically adoption. And then secondly, really sort of shared actually. So career and talent mobility, peer-to-peer recommendations, and targeted marketing campaigns, which is what you said. I think when we look at some of the broader responses, and we sort of come on to, maybe it's slightly different to that, and I think that's an interesting dynamic. But certainly when we see our customers who are perhaps most engaged and have the highest level of adoption, it's where content is part of a blend. Yeah. And I think I haven't got the specific percentages with me, but what we're seeing now is it's not just about compliance content. I think traditionally online content engagement and adoption was driven by compliance. We're seeing very high engagement. I think it's about 75% in self-directed learning beyond compliance. Exactly. So David, perhaps you share some of the...
But it's that living experience that I think is really interesting. And I think there's a couple of things in here that sort of stand out to me. So the first is that peer-to-peer recommendation. And they don't mean that they've ticked a star or done a little tick and say, I've given this a 5 rating. That is actually a personal recommendation of, this is really good, you should do it. And I think what that does is it puts pressure on us as L&D professionals to provide our audiences with those sorts of experiences that say, actually, I would say, Ollie, do that tomorrow or do that now because it is so good. And that's what raises the bar to say, you can't just get some content and put it out there. You need to find some good content.
Yeah.
And you develop good content, or you develop good content, or you surface that from your users. The other thing is just this integration into blended learning programs. I think that comes through almost at every stage, whether it was how do you maximize adoption, what are you doing, how are you using it within your organization. That is a constant theme. And it's something almost as a takeaway that in the past maybe blending hasn't been something that's been simple to do. But actually I think as you start to embrace newer platforms, actually it's becoming simpler to create this sort of mix of nudges of actually this is something that's relevant to you based on the feedback you've had from your performance review and things like that. So those things are really driving it. Actually that targeted marketing campaign, I think that number 3 is really important because that speaks to personalization and the level of personalization that really drives engagement. I think we all know what it's like to get something maybe in our own consumer lives when something actually just hits the button. There is nothing that will stop you clicking through and making a buy when the marketing team is insight is so in tune with you that actually they just got you at the right moment. I think that's what we need to think about maybe with our learning content, and that's what comes out here, that sort of really tuning into and being tightly aligned to what people's individual drivers are. So we've got some other things there. Search stands out quite highly. Integrated certification program starts to tail off into that curated catalog. Just having the curated catalog isn't enough to drive high adoption. And again, that's all a great takeaway.
I think that was fascinating to me, as I said, around us now as content providers and platform providers looking to solve that problem. I think if I was to summarize those 3 driving factors, I think it's relevance. So is it relevant to me in my role? Is it relevant to help me develop, perform better? Peer-to-peer recommendations are only going to be validated by people who know your role and know it's going to be good for you, rather than, oh, that was interesting, have a look. And I think as part of a blended program, there's the relevance and the motivation to want to learn and develop, rather than a standalone piece of content. And then targeted marketing campaign, hopefully you've got a good understanding of your audience and you're making it relevant. So I do think sort of context and relevant is the ultimate summary of what's going to drive any content or learning, not just digital, but I think in this context, that's most relevant.
So that's the high level view. Advocacy really matters, right? So it's the quality of the experience that you can deliver, aligned to people's needs, that's really important. And I think if you get through those sort of touch points and the touch points that you have, and you can think about touch points as being things that might be in the flow of work, so things like Microsoft Teams and Slack, how do you make things accessible there? You can think about things as being as part of an HR process. So what's the relevance and how well are things surfaced in your performance review or through your career site for internal promotions and talent mobility? Does that surface learning? These things start to add up, and the more advocacy you can create around those, the better the adoption will be.
Yeah.
So I'm going to skip over that. This is just a way of maybe thinking broadly about learning engagement. And what we're trying to say is the learning consumption, which is in the bottom right-hand corner, is driven not by just providing content and having touch points. You need to create a culture of learning. You need to hook into people's motivations, like Ollie was saying, and those can be driven by people's desire for their future skills. They can be driven by their current skill needs around their performance they need to deliver. Maybe they're just driven by their own personal agendas. But the more you release that motivation, if you haven't got a culture in place, then people won't follow through. They will just go, well, nobody else bothers learning around here, I don't think I'll worry. And that sense of trying to move all these cogs to get development to work is really, I think, what we're trying to say around that adoption model, really, and saying if you want to push adoption, you need to embed coaching, you need to embed feedback, you need to think about people's careers, you need to create those touch points, and that will drive consumption and drive outcomes if you're measuring them. So, the other thing we asked for or asked about was how do organizations engage with digital learning content in the marketplace? So how many providers do they work with? And what are they engaging them for? And again, this is really interesting. So again, remember, you've got small teams of 1 to 5, and you're working in small organizations mainly. Typically, a small proportion, about a fifth, have one vendor, and that's all they've got. And then you've got the vast majority that are working with 2 to 5 vendors across all their learning content, and then you're getting into a smaller 15% almost, or maybe 17% of people who use maybe 5 to 10 plus vendors, which are probably are larger organizations in reality. But actually, there's sort of, I think, a challenge in whenever you think about a relationship you've got to maintain and manage, that does use up time, and you need to be focusing most of your time on your customers, not your providers. So that is always a balance, but that is really encompassing your off-the-shelf and also providers to some extent. Now, what we also did is ask people, what do you engage people for? Where do you engage them around? So when you're looking at off-the-shelf content, which is in orange, what is that? When do you most use a particular type of vendor? And when do you use bespoke learning? Is that more about when you're releasing products, your own things, or is it about things that are maybe more generic skills? And there's a really nice pattern here of things that are more generic and open, being on the right-hand side, where people say, do you know what? If it's about IT technology, if it's about health and well-being, it's about personal effectiveness skills, actually it's about diversity, inclusion, or business skills, those things I will do through off-the-shelf content, because actually that's broadly relevant. It's maybe a little bit more generic.
Yeah.
On the other end of the scale, maybe on the left-hand side, you have things where there's more bespoke work, and actually that makes sense, right? So your products, your business processes, your organizational culture, maybe there's some specialist skills. You tend to commission more bespoke work in that area. The other interesting one is this green layer, which is where do you use user-generated content? And think about user-generated content as being where you get your subject matter expert or your end users creating content for you. Maybe it could be a short form, it could be probably a video, could be a little a capture on their phone. And on the left-hand side, we see a greater adoption of user-generated content than you do on the right-hand side. So it's all about your processes, your business, your culture. It's almost the expression of us as an organization, is where people are using their user-generated content. So you get things almost being skewed in that direction to the left-hand side for more bespoke and user-generated content, and more to the right-hand side where it's more generic skills for off-the-shelf content. But always there's a mix. So it's this blend. This is almost seeing the blend in action. Of actually, even around IT, there's things that I will want to capture which are user-generated. There are things I want to capture which are about bespoke as well. And that grey area, which Ollie was talking about in the middle, which is where actually there's a nice mix of leadership and management training, which is a combination of off-the-shelf and bespoke. And that's almost like a validation maybe of the last 15 years what people have been up to. But I guess it reflects some of your practices as well and what you see.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there was any great surprises when we saw that those results. I think probably the thing I took away most of the amount of mix within each of those areas. I probably would have assumed that there was very little off the shelf, or even more so off the shelf at the business products end. But it's interesting to see that, and certainly we see more of the right-hand side of that diagram. Most of our customers using off-the-shelf content, which is our business, in all of those areas. But increasingly identifying some of those areas for the reason of scale, agility, and as we said earlier, less so for cost. How do they use off-the-shelf content to solve that problem?
And I think it just gives you a sense of that balancing act. To some extent, the user-generated content is almost notionally seen as being free.
Yeah.
So that's an easy entry point. Bespoke projects tend to cost a lot more, and then per head you probably tend to see the off-the-shelf content being much more cost efficient.
Absolutely.
So there's that side of things. The other thing, just in terms of where people are looking to spend more of their money. So this is, where do you expect to invest in digital learning content? What do you expect to increase and decline over the year ahead? We've again broken it down into the user-generated content, bespoke content, and off-the-shelf content. And again, the overall impetus or the momentum is towards the right-hand side, right? So people aren't looking to spend less on any type or source of digital learning. People are hungry for more. There is a little bit more of a reining back around the bespoke content, maybe a little bit reining back around the off-the-shelf content, but the overall momentum, right, is to increase. The interesting one is people's focus around, actually, I should use more user-generated content. And actually almost that maybe reflects some of the cultural shift of having more of a creator economy, ubiquity of TikTok and Instagram, and maybe there's a generational move into that sort of style in a way. But actually I think there's an economic side of it too, which is actually there's a great wealth of information within the teams that we have, and actually there's an openness to embrace some of those sort of self-videoing tools than ever before. And I think that's really sort of broken through in here. The challenge typically has been, how do I create user-generated content that's good enough?
Yes.
And that continues to be, I think, a difficult issue. Want to come back tomorrow and hear what Laurie and team.
I was going to say tomorrow we'll be talking to some practitioners who are doing this for real. I think, as you say, often it's assumed that user-generated content must be easier and cheaper, but actually, like with a lot of things, you've got to be deliberate about how to do it, who's doing it. It's not just about technology, but you've got to make it easier to produce and distribute, I think.
Exactly. And the thing is, if you can find that sweet spot of a combination of a compelling expert who works good on video or can capture that information for you, then actually that's a great way of working in that style. I think another thing to highlight is actually you can set those sort of learning assignments as part of the blend, where the learning goal of the team is to create an output which summarizes how we do it here. So you can almost see that sort of journey from bespoke content, which might be about, this is how we do sales, and this off-the-shelf content, this is the approach to sales, but then the destination for that learning cohort to be, we want you to create some learning assets which tell us how we sell our product. And that takes you on that journey almost purposefully into user-generated content. But it also then creates that lens of quality, because people know that's going to be shared as part of that growing pathway of how we develop our people.
Yeah.
So, really interesting. The other thing, just in terms of what people do to choose the right partner, right? And maybe this is quite a timely one if you're walking around the show. What is the way of choosing the right partner? And again, we just put a list of things that we've seen people do in the past down. And this is what people said was the ranking. Yeah, so what do you do to select the right partner? Number one is understand the audience and context and the outcomes I want to achieve. So that's number one. Number two is I engage with my subject matter experts, really with the view that actually if my subject matter experts are involved, I'm probably not to blame if I've chosen the wrong stuff, right? So I think there is an element of covering my backside a little bit. The other one, just again, which is maybe a covering my backside thing, is actually it's signed off because it works within our IT estate, so it gets signed off from the IT team. But then you get into more the selection things, and it's give me a solution demo. Give me a trial with a priority audience so that I can start to evaluate what works, how it works, what sort of promotions work. So not only about the type of content, but the successful deployment approach and change management. So you get this sort of sense of how do we roll it out properly. Actually, the knowledge of the learning team and learning partners still features at number 6. So actually in terms of the selection process, it's who we know. I think what's interesting is if you don't now have a big network, then you might want to network with other people in other like-minded organizations to find out what they've done that works. But what's interesting is even engaging the audience in the selection process is not high priority for most, and that shocks me a little bit, because I think if you want to know that something's going to work, then you really should engage with the customer, and the customer ultimately, you might think there's a subject matter expert or the person who's paying you for the course, but ultimately it's the end user. So I think getting them involved is actually part of the change process as well. If they choose something that they love, then actually that's part of the peer-to-peer recommendation that we highlighted earlier on. So there can be method in the madness of bringing them in sooner. Just that sense of customer references, it's not very high. And again, I think that's quite interesting that actually people always want to get their own view, and they don't always trust what somebody else has done, maybe in a hurry. So, but we take loads of customer references when working with Fosway. It's really important to us. But I think finding a good customer reference is always helpful. And then just at the bottom of the list, that sense of RFP, RFI. So actually it's what you see and what you experience which matters more than have they got the tick box in the right forms. But that tends to be more of a compliance thing anyway.
Yeah, I think I was interested to see that at the bottom. We've certainly been on the receiving end a lot, and depending on who we have in the audience today, I'm sure you've written several in your time. So I was quite surprised that down the bottom. I think for me, the sort of number one is critical. You know, we spend a lot of time trying to make sure we understand who our customers are and what they're trying to do, which sounds obvious, but not always the case. And if you don't get that right, there's no point in doing anything else, regardless of who you get involved, regardless of how good your demo is, how flashy your product might be. Yes, it integrates with everything. If it's the wrong solution for the wrong problem, we're not going to go anywhere. We're not going to have a good relationship. So hopefully that's insightful for all of the flashy lights and great things you see around you today if you're going to walk around, and certainly something that we spend a lot of time doing.
But it's interesting, isn't it? That sort of combination of actually understanding the audience, the context, the needs, the outcomes. And if you're talking about it's for a learning culture, trying to square that circle, because there's almost two separate concepts, and bring them together is the biggest challenge, because you need to articulate that with your supplier if you want to know that you've got a good match. So I think that stands out really sort of head and shoulders in a way. It does in people's response, 82%. It was really, really up there. The other thing that we asked, how was that? I think that just overall, when you're going through, it is about the learning experience. And I know that's maybe overused, but the quality of the user experience and its ability to drive engagement is something that is what you really want to try and assess when you're going through a selection process. And having measures around that when you're going through selection, I think is something that you really need to focus on. And we've got some bits that I don't think we're sharing in this presentation that we started to break down into, so what does a good experience look like from a digital learning perspective? And I know we're going to release that with with a report later on in the year. And maybe if people sign up, we'll send them a copy of that report.
Absolutely.
It goes into another layer of granularity of actually, what is it in the design of the content which people are really engaging with, and what drives adoption in those sorts of ways. So that's really important. I don't want to dwell on here too much longer, but there we go.
Oh,
So
There's the punchline at the
there's
end.
the punchline. So, do take the survey. There's a QR code that's been put in here. We will be releasing the results later on in the year. I think we're looking at the spring, late
Yes,
spring,
we're looking
summer.
at continuing the survey for the next month or so, probably, and then we'll get all of those results together, and we'll be doing a series of discussions on each of those topics. So, ranging from why people use content, where they use it, how they use it, and then a separate session on how to choose the perfect vendor. Perfect vendor, I think, is probably elaborate. There is no perfect vendor, but how to go about helping those discussions and where people use it. So hopefully it's about, for us, giving something back to the community, but also validating a lot of the insights that help us develop our own products and services. So
my hope is that what we've done today is seed some of the questions about, okay, if that's what people are doing, how do you make it really work? And maybe that's some of the secret sauce that you'll be going through later with Laurie and
yes.
the team. What time was that?
So we've got a session at 12:30 today, which is looking about upskilling and reskilling and part of the agenda. And then tomorrow at 12:30, I'll be hosting a panel discussion with a number of practitioners where I'll be sharing a bit of this research, but hopefully asking some insightful questions to hear how they have actually put that into practice or whether that resonates with them. So we've got some great speakers from the likes of AstraZeneca and a number of others that elude me just at this time. But if you're here tomorrow, please join us. If you're online, please log in. But I think that just leaves me to say, David, thank you so much for your insights. As always, it's a pleasure working with you. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to hearing more insights and enjoy the rest of the show.
And if you want to ask any questions, we're
yes,
around.
of course. Any questions, please ask
A few minutes.
if there's any online. But thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for taking the time and sharing the time with us.